Welcome to the Electric Bus Learning Project's June webinar on how to fund electric school buses with a specific focus on the state of Oregon. We're excited that you all are here and are going to spend the next hour with us really diving into what's excitingly more and more information, especially around funding. So a little bit of housekeeping for today. As we work through our presentation today, please feel free to send questions in the Q&A panel rather than the chat on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will we'll roll through kind of our plan for the day and an agenda. And this presentation will be recorded and available along with other resources, hopefully by the end of day today. So I will go ahead and pass it off to Alison to talk a little bit more about our program.
Oh, good morning, everybody. This is Alison Wiley, and a lot of us know each other, and I'll be getting to know more of you this summer as I hopefully help you apply for the electric school bus funds from the EPA. So Neil and I together co-founded our electric bus learning project in January of 2020, and we love this work. We find electric school buses really exciting. This is me and Neil. We both like to be outdoors. Next slide. So we do a lot of different things, and we're responsive to what people need and want. We've done site visits. We can train people. We've done trainings in the past. This is another one of our trainings. We support you in finding funding. We're really aware that it takes extra funding to get electric school buses. We are funded still at this point by the Oregon Clean Fuels Program via Pacific Power's Electric Mobility Fund. And our project is also continuing with funding from Bonneville Environmental Foundation as we go forward. Next slide.
All right, so that's back to me. Real quickly, I'm going to launch a poll so we can see a little bit of who is in the room. I'm going to launch this as I start talking about today's agenda. So that poll should be showing up on y'all's screens. And while we're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about what we're planning on going through today. So we're doing some introductions right now. And we'll introduce the two of us, and then also Brock Dittus from Oregon Department of Education, who will also be presenting a little bit later. We will have a brief history about electric school bus deployments in the Pacific Northwest. We will go over kind of a little bit about the why of electric and Electric School Bus 101. And then the majority of our time after that is going to be focused particularly on different funding resources. So that's including the new federal clean school bus rebates. And then we're also going to try to hit at a pretty high level other Oregon specific funding streams that can be considered when you're planning either your first or scaling your electric school bus where you're at. Then we'll have some time for Q&A, hopefully at the end. But really, we hope that this is the start of a conversation and are happy to follow up afterwards. So looking at the poll results, it looks like we have most of us are pretty new to electric school buses on the call, though we have a good mix, which is exciting. And about 80% of you all are from school districts, and then we have a mix of government agencies and other folks here as well. So that is wonderful. Brock, do you want to go ahead and turn your video on and just say hi quickly to the group, especially with all the school districts in the room? I'm sure they'll recognize you.
Certainly. I keep on changing my appearance. So for some folks, it's the first time they've seen me without a large mustache, but it is good to be here this morning. Thanks for inviting me to be a part. And for all of you out there listening, I'm very excited to help partner with you to work for your success. It's a big piece of what we try to do at the agency. And so looking forward to working with some information and helping you find the right path forward.
All right, thanks, Brock. And then also just another quick note that for folks that are joining and signed up for the free lunch vouchers, we'll be sending those out tomorrow. So I'll be passing this off to Alison, who's going to go over why electric and why now.
Thank you, Neil. And it's a real pleasure to have Brock with us. Great respect for Brock, who knows school buses inside out. We all look to him for lots of leadership here in Oregon. Okay, so why electric? I think all of you know that I'm really passionate about electric, but the larger truth is that I'm passionate about school buses also in general, because they keep our society going around with public education. I'm especially big on zero emissions and electric for a few reasons. They really protect vulnerable populations and children. As you know, they have smaller lungs and they breathe a whole lot more. And they actually miss a lot of school when they get a lot of emissions in their lungs. Quiet. I know that school bus drivers can appreciate the lower stress of things being quiet. I know that propane is also quiet, but electric is yet more quiet. There's the greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change is accelerating, and zero emissions are good for everybody. We all share the same climate. Lower lifetime costs. Like most of you, I'm a thrifty person. I love to see costs go down. Fuel, especially with the very high prices now of diesel, fuel is much, much lower when we drive electric. Maintenance is much, much lower. I know that the high upfront cost of electric school buses is daunting. The price should be coming down. Overall, total cost of ownership will be going down over time with electric. Now we have funding availability. I know that's been the big holdup. The EPA's funding is extensive, over 5 years, and Neil's going to talk more about that. Vehicle availability, I have a great slide on that. The kinds of buses that you've been driving and operating so successfully all these decades, they're virtually all available now in electric models, along with purpose-built. There's at least 2 companies now that do only electric, and we can hold a special value for those. They are slow to arrive, but then diesel school buses are really slow to arrive now also. So everyone's in the same boat on that. Next slide, please. Okay, I have had to work at learning these things because I'm not an engineer, I'm a generalist. So instead of gallons of gas, think in terms of kilowatt hours. That's the unit of measurement of electric fuel instead of gallons of gas. And then the power is measured in kilowatts instead of horsepower. It's kind of like the size of the fire hose. Cool thing with driving electric, and I drive electric with my husband. We share an electric vehicle. Very cool and different feature is that power goes back into the batteries whenever you brake, or even when you take your foot off the accelerator. So going downhill, you can end up with more power in your batteries than when you started at the top of the hill. Really neat feature. And then finally, a little known fact here is that most bus yards right now, in the current situation, there's enough power there for 1 to 3 electric school buses. You don't need to be doing power upgrades as you just get started in almost all cases. Okay, so instead of an internal combustion engine, and those are real complex, there's an electric motor, and it has way fewer parts. So there's a simplicity there. Fuel costs, as I mentioned, are sharply reduced. We have pretty inexpensive electricity in the Pacific Northwest because of our hydropower. So the cost equation is good. There's no oil changes. There's a whole lot of parts that you just don't have to worry about. And then finally, with the regenerative braking that I talked about in the last slide, your brakes last a lot longer. One transportation director told me he thought that he might never need to replace his brake pads with his electric bus. So those are positives. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I find this exciting. Let's go from top left. And this Lion type C, Neil and I got to bring around to show to a number of school districts last year in May for Oregon's first tour. So the Lion is purpose-built. Of all of the, I'm going to say 600 to 700 electric school buses currently on the road in the nation, by far the largest number of those are Lions. They are purpose-built. Okay, top middle. This would be a Bluebird, and Bluebirds are very popular in Oregon. And Bluebird electric comes in both type D and type C. Over on the upper right, we have the Thomas built. This is type C, and it is called the Julie. And I've gotten to ride in all of these. They're always a beautiful ride. I did get to drive the Lion Electric briefly in a vacant parking lot last year. Later on, they told me I drove too fast. Oops. Lower left, this would be the Bluebird type A, and Lion also has a type A, although it's a flat nose. So it's typically a type D, but special ed, small. Lower middle, this would be IC, and they have fewer units on the road. Yeah, they have a lot fewer units on the road than Bluebird or Lion or Thomas Built for that matter. So they're kind of entering into the market. And then finally, on the lower right, we have the Green Power. I'm sitting here looking at a flyer that I got from the ACT conference. So this is purpose-built, and Green Power doesn't yet have a lot of these on the road. They are established in the electric public transit realm. They're called the Beast. Okay, let's go on. Okay, as I've often written about in my newsletter, charging is the hardest part of electric school buses. The buses themselves are not the hard part. In fact, they're kind of the fun, exciting part, but the charging is a make or break. Okay, so let's talk briefly about charging. Level 2 will take care of your needs. It's way less expensive. I would say that $10,000, and again, EPA will fund that. It meets your needs just fine. You can charge your bus overnight. And this is what most school districts go with. On the other hand, a number of districts on the right-hand side here, they do go with DC fast charging. And you can charge fast. 2 to 4 hours is very different from overnight. It costs probably 5x what your level 2 costs. The EPA does not choose to fund these because they're expensive. You're more likely perhaps to need a power upgrade. These are seen as better for vehicle to grid, but vehicle to grid really for practical purposes is still a number of years out. So that's the fast and dirty overview. Level 2 will get you there, and it's a lot less expensive. DC fast charging is something to be thinking about for future, perhaps. Oh, thank you for correcting me, Neil. Okay, so EPA does not deny direct charge costs. It's just that it won't go up to the limit of what it does cost. That's a good clarification. Okay, so we do have a number of electric school buses in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm always, really impressed by the people who go first, because it's hard to go first. So because this is an Oregon webinar, let's talk about the districts that have ordered or received their first electric school buses. That would be Beaverton School District. Craig Beaver is a very respected colleague of mine. He's running 2 Bluebirds type Ds in Beaverton. Other folks have them on order. I believe that Salem-Keizer has already received their first. It's a type A on order. Venla Pine School District and Portland Public Schools have theirs on order. That was funded by Portland General Electric. Reynolds School District, Rahana Nelson over not too far from me here in Portland. They're running their first Bluebird and have for, I think it's been more than a year. So there's lots and lots of electric school buses on order in Washington. And there's also some ICs running up in Vancouver, Canada. Across the nation, I believe it's about 354 school districts that are either running electric or have already ordered or gotten funding for their first electric. So it's coming on strong. It's happening. The funding profiles are different between our neighbors. California is running a whole lot of electrics with a lot of state funding. Washington, our neighbor to the north, they have chosen to use a lot of Volkswagen mitigation funds for their electric school buses. More power to them. Oregon has not gone the Volkswagen route. So far, to date, it's been investor-owned utilities who've been choosing to fund electric school buses. And that's been via the Oregon Clean Fuels program, program I'm a big fan of, and mostly Portland General Electric. We've seen Pacific Power step up a bit too. Oh, okay, so this was from last week's webinar. And now we're going over to funding, and I believe that Neil is going to take this.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Allison. That other slide snuck in there, but kind of important lessons learned from other districts is a really key part of how we do all of this work, is really leaning on the lessons that other districts provide. And so we'll share some of those lessons learned from that conversation later on as well. So funding, this is where things get exciting. So we have a great new opportunity that was passed as a part of the IIJA, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, commonly referred to as the infrastructure bill, back at the end of 2021. This is passed in the fall, and these details have been slowly trickling out over this year. So some of you we've had conversations with along the way, and it's honestly been a little challenging because we know a little bit, but then we all have very important questions about how that actually applies to me. Do I qualify? And so we kind of waited to do a broader training until we had the full application out, all of the funding criteria, so then we could get everyone started with the actual answers to those questions. So large scale, what we're talking about is there is $5 billion to be spent over 5 years for this clean school bus program. So that's large scale, 5 billion over 5 years. And we know that at least part of the requirement is at least half of that money is going to be going to just electric school buses. And then the other half is kind of broad in being clean school bus. So it'll be some of it will go towards electric, and some of it will go towards propane buses, but it is up to each year's program as to how that's actually allocated. So we'll go ahead and go to our next slide. So this is what we're talking about for this year. I want to make a note that this is just this year's program is called the Clean School Bus Rebate. And future years, there's going to be 4 more years of programming, and it will differ from this. They're going to kind of recognize successes and challenges from the program, and they'll adapt and modify the programs, or they might even add additional categories in the future. So for this year, what we're talking about is a minimum of $500 million that's going to be available for the Clean School Bus rebates. This is going to be split up into 2 categories. The zero emission funding pool is the for applications exclusively requesting zero emission buses, which essentially means battery electric buses. There will also be half of the money allocated towards clean school bus funding pool. And so this is folks that are applying either for a mixed application. So they're applying for both propane, natural gas, and battery electric, or if they're just applying for propane or natural gas buses, they would fit into that category. So those are kind of the two categories. Another important note that we want to make is that, there are a lot of folks on this, that this is one of the first times that you're really having a conversation about electric school buses. So we're going to talk not just about how to apply if you are rearing up and ready to go, but also kind of what those steps are. If this isn't the right year for you or the right application, we still want to take advantage of this to really get those conversations started, because it does take time to be ready for these programs. So then we're ready for the next cycle, because it will continue. There will be different programs in the next 4 years after this first year funding cycle is over. So who qualifies? This is a large question. With all these slides, I want to caveat this with, I'm going to give my best understanding of the answers to these questions, and your specific case may vary. We're happy to follow up and connect with resources to figure that out. So I'm going to kind of give the broad scale answers to all of these questions about qualification, priority, what's going to be able to be replaced. And then as we've found, as we've started working with some districts on this, there's going to always be some very specific questions that are relevant to your district. So there is clarity now, and there are opportunities to be able to clarify that before you submit your application. But just broad scale, we'll kind of hit the high points. And then really the point of this webinar is connecting out to resources, so then we can set up a follow-up call or connect you with the other resources, so we can get these applications through and help you in this process. So back to that question of who qualifies. The largest chunk of this is going to be state and this top left category, state and local governmental entities responsible for providing school bus service to one or more public school systems and or that purchase school buses. So what this largely means is school districts that provide bus service. So that one's for Oregon, that's specific. A lot of these definitions are specifically trying to make sure that some different setups in other states don't get unintentionally excluded. So that's that top right category, nonprofit school transportation associations. There are some states where their busing service is run through kind of what we would have in Oregon as OPTA. So that doesn't super apply here. Indian tribes, tribal organizations, or tribally controlled schools are eligible and also prioritized. And then eligible contractors, we can go through these in the future, but essentially there's also a pathway there's a couple of other pathways through contractors. So what is able to be funded through this? So we will, actually, I'm going to skip forward to funding levels, and then we'll come back to replacement guidelines. So this is the way that the funding works. This is probably, I'll send all of this out in the follow-up, but this is really the good stuff. So this funding program is a rebate. It's not a competitive grant. And the rebate amounts are set based on the vehicle class that you're replacing we're going to be mostly talking about electric, with an electric alternative. So if you are applying for a replacement to your larger type C or type D school bus, then whether you fit in the priority category or the other eligible category that's non-prioritized, you'd be eligible for either up to $375,000 or up to $250,000 for each bus that you apply for. This will have other examples in here of other vehicle classes and what the eligible reimbursement rates are. So that's the kind of big picture for what this is it's largely trying to say, if you're priority, we're going to give you close to the full cost of a bus. And if you're non-priority, we're going to give you a pretty big chunk. That's what you should generally be taking away from this. On the electric side, that won't be the case on the propane side. And then the other piece of this is that what you'll have to do, we're happy to help with, is look and figure out what vehicles you're going to be considering for this program. You're actually able to apply for up to 25 buses as a part of one application that comes from your district. And with each one of those buses, There's also a separate budget if you get selected for out of kind of the lottery process. There is also the opportunity to reimburse for infrastructure expenses. And so that, if you're getting an electric bus, so that those infrastructure expenses would be either $13,000 or $20,000, depending on whether you're prioritized or not. And that's per bus that you get funding for. So that was where Alison had mentioned earlier. It kind of depends on the charger, whether that's going to be covering your full costs or not, and also very site-specific items there as well. So I'm going to go take a step back. So that's kind of the exciting piece. That's what's getting funded. But as a part of this, it is a rebate program for replacement. So this is a little bit about how that process works. So you're going to identify which buses in your fleet would be replaced by these electric once you receive them. So kind of large scale, how this works is you're going to apply for a certain number of buses, and whether they're going to, the type of bus and whether they're going to be electric, propane, or natural gas. We hope electric. Then in the fall, you'll be notified of whether you were selected or not. And then if you are, you have some time, we'll go over the timeline later, but you have some time to actually put in the order for that bus. And once you have a purchase order, then you submit that back to EPA and they'll give you the funds to be able to spend on that bus. So you don't have to buy the bus and wait for reimbursement. This is an upfront rebate once you have the purchase order for the vehicle that you're going to be choosing. The other piece of this is that after 2 years, and our understanding is that this is after 2 years of you getting the bus, with the purpose of it takes some transition time to figure out, get things on route, iron out the kinks, and work through what you have in terms of training and all of those pieces before you have to get rid of your identified replacement bus. So these are the requirements for those replacement buses. The first category is that you would need to be replacing a bus that is 2010 or older, diesel powered, that would need to be scrapped. Or if you don't have any eligible 2010 or older diesel buses and you're requesting an all-electric bus replacement, you can scrap, sell, or donate the newer buses after that 2-year period. The other requirement for these, all these vehicles, is they have to be 10,000 pounds or more. They have to be fully operational at the time of the application. And then the other piece is that they have to have provided bus service to the public school district for at least 3 days a week on average during the 2021-2022 school year at the time of applying. And this does exclude COVID-related school closures, but I know that all operations were super wonky this year, and so it might take a little bit of diving through the details to work through that inventory with you all. These are those details that I just talked about. So the program is set up with a couple of different prioritizations. So the first thing that they're going to do is they want to see at least one application get funded in every state, in every state. So there's going to be, that's the first tranche that's going to be getting funding. Then after that, they have a list of prioritization criteria, and they're going to try to fund as many projects out of the prioritized criteria before they move on to the kind of the rest of us. So these are the prioritization criteria. I'll go through them quickly, and I'll also mention that the EPA already has a list because this is pulling from data sets that are easily identifiable. So it should be pretty easy to say, yes, I am prioritized, or no, I'm not. So I'll send that list around in the follow-up email as well. So first prioritization criteria is high need school districts and low income areas. So this is essentially based on the small area income and poverty estimates of having 20% or more students living in poverty. And then the next category is rural school districts. So these are school districts that through the NCAS data are considered rural, remote, or rural distant, which is code 43 and 42. And then tribal school districts. So these are BIA funded school districts that have received or and school districts that have received basic support payments for children who reside on Indian land. So those are the prioritization criteria. We have that list and are happy to send it out. But what that generally should say is, if I'm prioritized, I really should consider applying, because there's a better chance that I'm going to get funded. But we don't want that to mean anything different for the majority of school districts that won't be prioritized. And the reason why is that the first year of any funding program, you never know how many people are going to apply. But those applications will help shape the way that the future programs are made. And what we've heard from the EPA is that there's specifically $500 million allocated to this program. And if they get significantly more than those applications, especially from electric applications, they have the back end ability to actually expand the funding availability all the way up to that first $1 billion that would have been allocated for this year. So there's a lot of funding available. We want everyone to be able to apply, and both because it gets the ball rolling, and no one has a crystal ball to say if you're going to get funded or not. But it's a lottery system. It's not based on the first come, first serve. And so with that lottery system, it's based on prioritization, based on types of buses that you're applying for, and then it's based on luck. So if you get funded, you'll get funded completely, and those are which is really exciting. So we'll jump over a important piece in this process. Is there's a somewhat of a new system called the Systems for Award Management, or Sam.gov, and we want to make sure that folks are able to jump on this early. So then they can, you actually have to apply through this, and it's your district will have a registration here. Alison, I know that you had a conversation earlier, if you wanted to share some of those lessons learned here.
Oh, thank you, Neil. Yeah, the Sam.gov thing, here's the bottom line. Get started on it like yesterday, because it's not as easy as we all hope it would be. What I've been finding, Neil and I, as we're working with districts here in Oregon, I'll give you two examples. When we ask if your district is yet registered with Sam.gov, the folks go to their finance department of their district and they find out, yes, we are. Great, that's wonderful. The challenge we're finding is for the transportation director, who's probably going to be the one submitting the application. They need to be one of the 4 people on the account, especially with a district of size. Those 4 email addresses are probably already taken up. And so you're probably in that case going to need to partner with one of the 4 people in your district who is in Sam.gov with their email address, and partner with them. And I know that all is cumbersome. I was also told by a really good transportation director source this morning that the way that federal grants are really set up with districts is for education grants and not for operations grants. And of course, school buses are operations. So the bottom line is that it's going to probably take you some time to navigate Sam.gov. The application itself, on the positive side, I've been told is easy. It's 1 page, but you need to do a whole lot of preparation prior, as in figuring out exactly which buses you're going to be at, 1 or more buses to be asked for replacement. You have to do a lot of preparation in order to then go in and zip out the application. So Neil, that's kind of what I've got. That's my summary.
That's great. Yeah, so that's one of the many next steps that we'll kind of share, kind of following up from there too. So that's great. So Sam.gov, put that on your list. Check in with your business office or somewhere at your school district to try to get those things connected, like Alison had mentioned. So we'll keep moving on. We're almost done with the federal ones, and then we'll jump into the Oregon-specific funding streams. So this is just an overview back of that timeline. So the kind of first piece is figuring out that Sam.gov backend piece. Then it's really good to connect with your utility and community partners. That would be like connecting with the Electric Bus Learning Project. We can help set up some meetings with your utility because that's another good resource we'll talk about later on in the presentation. And then the application process is open right now. So between now and August 19th, the funding application for this first round is open. Like I mentioned, they will conduct the lottery, and there's specifics on how things are prioritized in the lottery and random numbers and all of that. But they'll conduct that and notify winners in October. And then that's when you will have 6 months between October, once you're notified, between then and April of 2023 to order your bus and work with your utility to kind of figure out how you're going to do your infrastructure piece. And then the EPA's, once you have those purchase orders, the EPA will pay you up to the maximum that was set out in the funding criteria. You'll receive your electric school buses, install your chargers, and then you have to dispose or kind of follow that replacement process for those replaced buses within 2 years. And this timeline they recognize is flexible based on the lead times that it takes to get new buses right now. So for us, what we have is kind of next steps. We can schedule a call. We'll send out that resources email. You can just reply to that if you're interested in getting just a quick call with Alison or myself to kind of help talk through what next steps are. We want to make sure we're checking with our admin about Sam.gov. And then we'll also share some EPA webinars. They're holding weekly webinars now to help with this application process. So what we're trying to say is there's lots of resources, there's lots of support. We know you all have a lot going on. And thank you all for joining the last week of school for many of you and in what is a stressful time. So August 19th application deadline. So that wraps up our federal section. If you have questions for those, please put them in the Q&A section. There's a little tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you put the questions in there, then we'll have them nicely organized if we have time for Q&A at the end. So we're going to jump into Oregon-specific resources. So we're going to start with the transportation grant with Brock from Oregon Department of Education. Then I'm going to go kind of high level through the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, the Public Purpose Charge Schools Program, also known as Senate Bill 1149 funding, and utility programs. So Brock, you're going to be up next if you want to turn your camera back on. Brock is the I think this is still true, the operations and policy analyst for ODO's Pupil Transportation Unit. He's been involved in school transportation since 2007, when he started his career as a school bus driver at Portland Public Schools as a special needs route driver. He became an ODE certified behind the wheel instructor and core instructor in 2015. In 2018, he accepted his current position, evaluating and assisting programs across Oregon in compliance and equitable service to their communities. When he's not working, he enjoys music, bicycle exploration, and good coffee, and he lives with his wife and 2 sons in Salem, Oregon. Take it away, Brock.
Thank you, Neil. It's true, I do enjoy good coffee. This is one of those days where I actually didn't open my cup. It was in the insulated mug until about 10 o'clock or something. So I'm sure some folks can relate. Some folks also might be asking why I waited so long to begin, but it's just how it goes. So it's good to be with you this morning. I probably have far more slides than I can cover in detail, but I do just want to remind folks of some of the mechanics of the traditional state funding that happily interleaves pretty well with your acquisition of a new electric school bus if you get one. Just some high level things. It's hard to find a picture of an electric school bus built to a different state standard. I'm sure it's probably a good reminder that there are some Oregon specific design elements that you'll want to take into account when you're placing your order. And by this point, most folks who deliver those should be aware of them. But if you've got questions about that, feel free to reach out later on as well. So these are some slides that my colleague developed in explaining kind of how the state school fund and transportation grant as part of the state school fund operates. So I'll just begin here. The Estimate of membership and revenue reconciled with actual financial data and pupil transportation reports. Everyone's familiar with the annual reports, which we'll be releasing to you very shortly for this coming cycle. Those are due September 1st every year, and that helps us adjust the numbers that we have in the estimates to make sure that they're accurate and they represent what happened. So your accounting on your end at the school district and any adjustments that need to be made for non-reimbursable purposes are all taken into account through that reporting. As you can see, we've got, this is the largest grant in the state school fund in 1920. These numbers are getting older now, but that's a very large number there. You can see we're into the millions. And that is essentially, I want to say, the state school fund is not limitless. But the transportation expenses are taken out of the grant first. There's a kind of an uncomfortable seesaw with that, in that anything spent on transportation is not available for other parts of the fund. I think that that results in some of the friction that you may be experiencing if you're coordinating transportation in your district. That obviously there needs to be enough money to go around so that no one has to uncomfortably cut corners. But that is kind of how it works. So the life cycle of transportation grant, as you can see here, this is an example of from 2019 to 2021, and then 2022 at the end. The evaluation of how the numbers are crunched is it's a long process to make sure we get it right. And just to point out, I know there's some folks here that are involved with contracted operations. As you already know, we don't reimburse vehicle purchases for contracted operations. However, the expense of hiring a contracted transportation operation is a reimbursable cost under the rule set. So as you can see, we'll bring in the estimates based on kind of what we've seen and what we project from the previous year's reporting. We'll start paying based on the estimate on that July number there at the beginning of the new fiscal year, or the new, yeah, I guess the fiscal year. When we get to February, that's the time that I've probably finished tracking down all of your reporting numbers, and I've pulled it together so that our office can adjust that estimate and make sure that any differences, any adjustments that need to be made that are different than the estimate can be accounted for. And then the final grant is wrapped up there at the end of that 2-year cycle. Like I said, this is a long process, but we make sure that everything is accounted for. I know that every year I deal with some of the questions of, hey, why isn't this school bus showing up here? One thing to keep in mind is that vehicles need to be used for reimbursable purposes. Usually that involves home to school service, which I believe at this point the electric school bus is probably best suited for, as well as academic field trips that are directly connected to classroom grades. So anything like sports or other extracurricular activities would not be covered in that grant. So it's important to make sure that if you're bringing a vehicle on board and you want to be reimbursed for it, that you plan for its use accordingly. Let's go to the next slide. You can see we've got the estimate here. We go through that. That's something that your business manager will be, and I didn't see if anybody here is involved with business management. My assumption is that I'm speaking mostly to folks who do the operational side of transportation, so we can probably skip over most of this. This is a picture of one of the forms. As you can see, the method, we will adjust the numbers based on how things are done. The simplest way to explain this is that some folks will account for all their transportation expenses in one large bucket, and that would include both expenses that are eligible for reimbursement as well as those that are not. And so, as you can see here, if that's the case for your accounting, we will take the mileage that was driven for non-reimbursable purposes, and we'll do a reduction based on a mileage cost. That cost changes every year, and we've got the most current information, I think, on this year's forms. So that's one way to adjust for it. However, a lot of folks also do accounting, especially I think it tends to be with some of the larger districts. If you account for your non-reimbursable transportation expenses in a separate bucket, it makes it easier on our end, and you report zeros on this form. As always, if you got questions, feel free to get in touch. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, we didn't talk about the breakdown here, but we have the standard reimbursement rate is 70%. That means that for qualifying purchases and qualifying expenses, we're going to reimburse 70% of that. Your local district will pay the remaining 30%. That is, will reduce the amount, I think, for a lot of grant funding. So if you've got questions, I probably can't speak to every situation here, mostly because I'm not the numbers guy. I'm the guy who works more with the operational side as well. But we can track down questions about how grant funding interleaves with your purchases. In general, I would assume that we'll reduce the purchase price for anything your district didn't pay, and we'll repay the percentage from the school fund based on that. So most folks will be getting 70%. The top 20 districts with the highest costs for average daily membership will receive 90%. Those are usually small rural schools. The next 20 after that will receive an 80% reimbursement. And then again, for most folks, that's a 70% number. Let's go to the next slide. This is a breakdown just kind of the thing. I won't spend too much time on this since we're talking more about the grant funding opportunities that you'd be working with. But I think, is that my last slide there? Okay, this is important. Adam Krein, like I mentioned, he's the numbers guy. I usually turn to him with my questions, and if you ask me one, oftentimes it goes on to him before I respond to you. So I do recommend reaching out to Adam if you've got questions. If you work with your school's business operations, then you're probably familiar with him already. But he is the state school fund manager, and he coordinates a lot of those things. So he's the person to reach out to when there are technical questions. That said, I am happy to work on any questions you have. So please reach out to me as well. And I've got my team's email address there also. So let's see. I think that's fewer slides than I expected. So I think I may have done okay. Neil,
Awesome.
I'll give the floor back to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Brock. Yeah, so I'm going to keep rolling through, and I want to put out a caveat for these future slides, for these next slides. We had a really limited amount of time, so I know a lot of these folks are on the call, and I'm going to do my best to not butcher the material, but I'm really going to hit high level. I'm sharing these slides from previous presentations, but I'm in no way an official representative of DEQ or Oregon Department of Energy or the electric utilities that we'll be describing. But really, my main goal is getting you connected with those, so you know what resources are. And then we can get you connected to those programs for the specifics. So I'm going to go quickly through the Oregon Clean Fuels program. In a nutshell, this is a system based on fuels sold in the state of Oregon. Those mandatory fuels will create deficits, the gasoline and diesel, and we're on kind of a glide path to use less and less fossil fuels in the state. And then on the opposite end of that, so if they're generating more deficits than credits, then we have the opportunity to kind of backfill with sustainable fuels. So that's ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, but then also on our side and kind of what we're talking about is electricity. So some of you may have experience with this program if you have any propane buses in service. It's a very similar process, but on the electric side. So there's lots of clean fuel applications in Oregon. This is a really broad sweeping program, but this is very relevant for us, especially when it comes to electric school buses. So essentially, big picture is if you've done this before for propane, you know how this works, but you will generate credits for any electricity that's used to fuel an electric school bus, because it's not a fossil, or it's not gas or diesel that's funding that bus. So you're going to generate these credits, and then they can be exchanged on a market that you can use that funding to kind of help fund some of the additional cost of running an electric bus. So the big piece that's kind of the new piece of this that's important to share is around advanced crediting. And so this new program is not yet in practice, but is expected to kind of start accepting applications in July. And what this large picture does is it's trying to say, okay, these credits over time are helpful, but the upfront cost is still high. So what you can do is you can apply to this program. You can work with Corey Ann Wind at DEQ to get an advanced credit for what your estimated credits that you would have generated over the first 6 years of your program, up to 6 years of your program. You can get that up front. And then you'll still go through the same process of reporting all of the energy or all the electricity that is dispensed into the bus. Over that time, you'll kind of pay off the credits that have already been prepaid to you. And there's a whole process for if you end up using the bus more than you expected, then as soon as you pay off those 6 years of estimated credits, then you start generating credits on a regular basis. Or if it takes longer than that, then you have a longer period of time to kind of stretch those out. So this is an example of what this might look like for a school district. What this kind of based on these assumptions, you're talking about a pool of funds that could be on a regular system. This is all based on the market for credit, so you can't quote any of these numbers, but could be somewhere around for $4,000 to $5,000 a year, or for the 6-year advanced crediting, that would be about $25,000 upfront. So this is just a brief example. So similarly, this is who is eligible for these programs. This is going to be really applicable for electric school buses. And this is that process that I was kind of talking about of you're going to apply ahead of time. And this also, if there's folks on the call, this is something that you want to check with your utility and other funding sources, because there are some utilities that are claiming that as part of their program agreements will claim these credits on your behalf, so you wouldn't be eligible for this. So we're going to jump quickly because I want to make sure that we get all this information out for you before our 12 o'clock deadline. And I'm going to do a quick overview of another pool of funding that's been used just for a couple of school districts, but for school buses, but it is used in a lot of other districts. So this is Oregon Department of Energy's Public Purpose Charge Schools Program, also known as Senate Bill 1149, which is the enabling legislation. And this is largely from a public purpose charge on Portland General Electric and Pacific Power's electric utility bills. And then there's a percentage of this, 10%, that comes to school districts. 74% goes to the Energy Trust of Oregon to fund their programs. And then 16% of it goes to Oregon Housing and Community Services. So this was first assessed in 2002, but this program just got enabling legislation to extend it all the way to 2036. So this is funding that we know will be happening for an extended period of time. So that funding that comes to school districts, these are the eligible school districts that eligible facilities that get this funding. So it's about 110 facilities. This is districts. So these are facilities owned by the school district within PGE or Pacific Power territories. It's only going to be eligible for those folks. And new facilities within the first 2 years, as well as administrative and facility maintenance buildings, don't generate these dollars. In previous legislation, it actually extended what this was available to in the past were typically efficiency and renewables programs at school districts. A couple years ago, this extended to be able to help with fleet audits, purchase or leases of zero emission vehicles, including buses, and the purchase and install of charging stations. So what that did is back in 2019 is it incorporated this to be able to allow us to be able to use this for electric school buses. So this funding is funding that is already kind of probably accounted for in your district. So you need to check if this funding is available. If you're a PGE or Pacific Power customer, you'll probably have some of this funding, but whether any of it's available to you is kind of up to that. Where we've seen it used a lot in the past is kind of backfilling some of those gaps from other projects or additional expenses that come up. So it's a good, valuable piece there. I'm going to have to skip through a little bit. It's eligible to be used for a lot of items right now. So if you have the funding available and have a gap for an application that we want to see a bus get on the road, definitely check with your school district to see if that funding is available. And I'll Christy Spoon and Tracy Richardson are going to be the good contacts for that if you have questions going beyond there. So lastly, I'd be remiss to not mention the utility conversations that you really should be happening early on in the process. So regardless of whether there's incentives available, it's always important to start a conversation with your electric utility. What they'll hopefully be able to do is tell you a little bit more about what capacity you have on site, what upgrades might be needed depending on what charging solution you're going for, and the scale of the project that you're working on. We're happy to help set up those conversations. Also, checking in about incentives. The incentives are going to vary, but different utilities will have different programs that could help with this process. Yeah, so it's really important to figure this out. And those incentives are typically based on where the power that your bus yard is getting, as opposed to the schools that are being served, but it varies utility by utility. So our program, the Electric Bus Learning Project, has been largely funded through these clean fuel dollars that Pacific Power has gotten. And so I'll just do a brief overview of some of the opportunities that Pacific Power has for Pacific Power customers. So you should be able to see on this map a rough overview of where the Pacific Power utilities are. But we can always do that check for you if you're not clear about who serves your who's your electricity provider. So one of the opportunities is the Electric Mobility Grant. This was able to help fund any kind of exciting electric mobility project you might be interested in, including school bus electrification. This is what helped fund Ben Lapine School District's project, which they still haven't received their bus, but they were funded through the Electric Mobility Grant. Applications are already open for this and are due August 31st. I'm happy to help connect those resources as well. Technical assistance. If you are, again, in Pacific Power territory, there's the opportunity to actually have an engineer come out and do some technical assistance to map out what your capacity is and what different scaling would look like for you. It's a really great resource to have to be able to put into future applications. They also have a grant matching support fund. So if you're interested in a grant and there's required grant match, you can apply for grant matching support, as well as a competitive grant for grant writing support. So it is 11:59. We're in the Q&A section, but I promised that I would get you all out on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch a second poll for all of you that are able to hang on. So we can stick around and answer a few questions. Just go ahead and throw those in the Q&A section. But if you can fill out this poll and put those questions in the Q&A, we'll have the opportunity. We can follow up with folks after the fact. And like I mentioned many times during the presentation, I'll be sending out a resource packet. And that's going to include the recording of this webinar. If there's any questions that kind of come through, feel free to email Alison or myself. And if there's any questions that come through that seemed like it would be really helpful to share with the whole group, I'll be sure to do that as well. And we're at our time. So again, we'll stick around for a few more minutes if folks have questions, just to go ahead and throw those in the chat or the Q&A section. But if you are on to your next appointment or lunch, feel free to hop off. And we really enjoyed spending some time with you all today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the presentation, and then we'll see if any questions came in. So thank you all. Alison and Brock, if you're still around and can stick around, you can turn your video on.
Happy to hang out.
As am I.
Oh, the hybrid question. Can I take this one, Neil?
Go for it.
You know, it's so interesting. I spent a lot of my career in public transit, and hybrid buses have happened a lot in public transit. I've never yet heard of a hybrid school bus. Have either of you, Neil or Brock?
No, I'm unaware. I think it sounds like the question came up a couple of years ago at a conference I was at, and it seemed like the manufacturers were all moving in the direction of electric only.
Right.
Yeah, and so I'm curious as to why. I don't remember what the answer was, but I think part of it could be that it was just easier, I think, to make the full jump for those who would adopt the technology,
Right.
and for those who wouldn't, you know, the combustion fuel would probably be the best option for them. So it's, yeah, I haven't heard of any motion in the hybrid direction.
Okay, I think we can safely say that hybrid school buses do not exist in this country, but there's lots of hybrid public transit buses, although I think that they're moving in the direction of electric only in a general way. Oh, somebody said that, Huh. Now this is
My
new to me.
colleague Scott, yeah, he said that there was one once in Olympia. That's interesting. I hadn't heard about that.
And then Arthur
that's
Hard
also
is
some time
sharing
ago.
that there was a Thomas built hybrid. Wow, that's new information for me. Oh, I've got a link. Safety liner 2010. Arthur is sharing a link that only the panelists can see right now. I guess I could pass that link on to everyone. It looks interesting.
And that probably indicates that they tried it and didn't have a lot of commercial success, at least.
You think so?
Maybe there was interest, but maybe the folks didn't adopt. So I'm not sure. Yeah, it was a while ago, he says. And it was also, I would imagine, you know, things were different at that time as far as demand and questions. But yeah, I don't know all the reasons the manufacturers went away from the hybrid technology, but yeah, I haven't heard any motion on future developments around that.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, it's great. We didn't get we covered a lot of material here, and I think the main goal was really just trying to connect out to those resources, share any updates that we have to be able to kind of move this process forward and help support districts in Oregon. So do you all have any kind of closing thoughts before we shut this down?
I have a closing thought, but I do want to answer the question about hydrogen fuel cell technology.
Great.
Really parallel to the hybrid question, there's a number of hydrogen fuel cell public transit buses, and you have to invest hugely in the infrastructure to do hydrogen fuel cell, but then you have a small incremental cost. There don't exist, to my knowledge, any hydrogen fuel cell school buses. I think because the infrastructure is really expensive.
And I'll add to that, I think that hydrogen fuel cells are a really valuable resource for the medium and heavy duty space. But we are really seeing a lot of investment in the areas that really don't have an electric alternative right now. So earlier on, it was, you know, we were kind of experimenting throwing hydrogen fuel cells in a lot of different vehicle types and a lot of different uses. And I think where we're at now is we've proved the commercial availability and success of all electric options. And so where those technologies exist, there's not as much of a reason or justification for the hydrogen. But for the areas that are even harder to electrify, then those are the areas where you're seeing most of the investment in hydrogen. So some of the long haul trucking and other kind of similar platforms.
So my closing thought, since you asked, Neil, is that I really want to encourage people to apply. And even if the lottery doesn't favor you in this first round of funding, you will have taken a lot of steps forward, because I'm positive that in future years, it's a 5-year funding program here by EPA. I'm positive that as the future goes forward, you can get funding for your first electric school bus or for additional electric school buses.
Yeah, great. Brock, any final comments?
Just to offer once more that if people have questions about the operational side or the financial side, I'm happy to assist as I'm able. So do reach out.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We're really excited to help kind of usher in the next wave of electric school buses in Oregon. So thank you all for joining, and we'll be sure to follow up, and please feel free to reach out with any additional questions.
Bye-bye.